They searched for him under torchlight. They searched for him in daylight. They searched with dogs, with whispers, with names written on paper. And still he vanished. In the deep South, where silence could be more dangerous than screams, one black man slipped through a net that was never meant to fail. For 10 years the KKK hunted him. 10 years of burned barns, false tips, threats carved into doors, and men who swore they had almost caught him. Almost. But not once did they lay hands on him. This story doesn't begin with courage. It begins with fear. In 1924, the town of Briar Creek didn't appear on most maps. A cluster of wooden homes, a feed store, a church, and a rail line that passed through without stopping. But everyone knew what Briar Creek really was. It was controlled. Not officially. Not on paper. But everyone understood who decided what happened after dark. The Klan didn't march every night. They didn't need to. Their power lived in suggestion glances held too long, conversations that stopped when someone walked in, jobs that vanished without explanation. And that's where Elijah Moore lived. Elijah wasn't loud. He wasn't defiant in the way white men feared. He worked with his hands, fixed wagons, sharpened tools, slept early, and spoke softly. That softness is what made them underestimate him. Until the night everything broke. It happened behind the mill. A white overseer, drunk and angry, accused Elijah of stealing scrap iron. No proof. No witnesses. Just an accusation spoken loud enough to carry. Elijah denied it. Calmly. Respectfully. That was mistake number 1. The overseer shoved him. Elijah didn't swing back. Mistake number 2. The crowd that formed wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. One man ran to fetch others. Another sent word down the road. By the time Elijah realized what was happening, the accusation had already changed. Now it wasn't theft. Now it was attitude. Now it was insubordination. Now it was setting an example. Elijah knew what those words meant. He didn't run immediately. That saved his life. When the first rope appeared, he waited. When the men turned their heads to argue about where to tie him, Elijah moved. Not fast, not panicked, but decisive. He slipped behind the mill, dove into the creek, and disappeared into the reeds. By the time they realized he was gone, the night had swallowed him whole. They found his footprints by morning. They found his coat caught on a thorn bush. They found nothing else. And that's when the hunt became personal. Because men like them didn't lose. Not to someone like Elijah. Not in a town like Briar Creek. Within days flyers went up. Not official. Handwritten. Passed quietly. Promises of reward. Promises of forgiveness for anyone who helped. They searched farms. They searched churches. They searched homes of people who had never spoken to Elijah once in their lives. But Elijah wasn't hiding where they expected. He was moving. For the first year, Elijah never stayed in one place longer than 3 nights. He learned the language of back roads. He learned which barns were safe by the way the dogs barked or didn't. He learned which towns had men who asked questions and which had men who minded their business. He never used his real name. Sometimes he was Eli. Sometimes he was John. Once, for 6 months, he was simply the quiet man who fixes things. The KK adapted. They always did. They spread rumors that he'd murdered someone. They claimed he'd joined radicals. They told sheriffs he was armed and dangerous. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter. Fear did. By year 3, they were no longer just searching. They were waiting. They watched rail yards. They watched river crossings. They questioned black men who looked similar to Elijah, same height, same walk, same silence. Some were beaten for it. Elijah heard about those men while hiding under floorboards and sleeping in haylofts. Each story added weight to his steps. Each name carried guilt he couldn't set down. He began leaving towns before dawn, not because he was afraid, but because he refused to let someone else pay for his survival. That was his rule. Never stay long enough to become a liability. By year 5, the KKK told themselves a lie. They said Elijah was dead. It was easier that way. But deep down, they knew better. Because every time a barn door creaked open in the night, every time a stranger fixed a broken axle too quietly, every time a black man walked through town without lowering his eyes, they felt it. He was still out there. And the fact that they couldn't touch him began to rot something inside them. Elijah changed too. He stopped thinking in days. He thought in exits. He stopped forming attachments. He memorized faces the way other men memorized prayers. He learned that survival wasn't about speed. It was about timing. And that lesson would carry him into the most dangerous year of all, the year they came closer than ever. Year 6 was a year the silence broke. Until then, Elijah Moore had lived inside the margins between towns, between names, between moments when people looked too closely. But silence doesn't stay empty forever. It fills with rumors, and rumors travel faster than men on horseback. It started in Jackson Hollow. A black preacher was beaten after refusing to name a man who fit Elijah's description. The preacher survived, but the message didn't need repeating. Elijah heard about it 2 nights later while sleeping behind a collapsed smokehouse. That was the first time he understood something clearly. They weren't just hunting him anymore. They were punishing the idea that he was still free. And that changed everything. Jackson Hollow was different from the places Elijah usually passed through. Smaller, tighter. People watched each other too closely. He'd planned to stay one night no more. By sunset, he already knew he'd miscalculated. A white man at the general store stared a second too long. Another asked where Elijah learned to repair tools so well. A third didn't speak at all, just stepped outside and waited. Elijah finished his work, accepted payment he didn't want, and walked out calmly. He didn't run. Running made noise. He turned down the east road, then doubled back through an alley, slipped behind the church, and crawled beneath a loose foundation plank he'd noticed earlier. By the time 3 men reached the road with lanterns, Elijah was already underground, holding his breath while dust fell into his mouth. They searched until midnight. They missed him by less than 6 feet. From that night on, Elijah stopped trusting coincidence. If a place felt safe, he assumed it wasn't. If someone smiled too easily, he prepared to leave. The KKK escalated. They stopped posting notices. They stopped spreading rumors publicly. Instead, they leaned into something worse: quiet coordination. Names passed from mouth to mouth. Descriptions refined. Patterns analyzed. They learned how he moved. They learned he fixed things. They learned he avoided conflict. They learned he never stayed near rivers longer than a day. And they learned something else. He was getting tired. Year 7 nearly ended him. Winter came early, and Elijah misjudged the cold. He took shelter in a lumber camp where men didn't ask questions, as long as you worked hard and spoke little. For 2 months it was almost normal. Too normal. One morning Elijah woke to silence. No axes, no laughter, no boots in the snow. He reached for his coat and froze. Outside the cabin stood 6 men. No robes, no hoods. That was how he knew. The foreman stepped forward, voice steady. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He only said one sentence: "You've been hard to find." Elijah didn't wait for the rest. He bolted through the back window, hit the snow hard, and ran not toward the woods, but toward the camp's tool shed. He kicked the door open, overturned barrels, and sent nails scattering across the ground. Behind him a man screamed as he fell. Elijah didn't look back. He vanished into the tree line as gunshots cracked the air, wild, panicked, inaccurate. That was the closest they came, and it haunted them. By year 8, Elijah realized something unsettling. The KKK needed him alive. Dead men became martyrs. Captured men became warnings. They wanted him found. So Elijah did the one thing they never expected. He stopped hiding completely. In the spring, he walked openly into a river town where the Klan had influence but not control. He took steady work. He attended church. He let people see his face. Not long enough to be trapped. Long enough to be remembered. He let rumors form, but not settle. He left just as whispers began turning into questions. When men wrote in asking about him, they always arrived a day too late. This wasn't recklessness. It was misdirection. And it worked. The KKK began chasing echoes instead of footprints. Year 9 broke their patience. They accused the wrong man again. They burned the wrong barn again. They threatened the wrong family again. Every mistake chipped away at their authority. People began to notice. Not openly, not loudly, but silence shifted. And somewhere deep inside that silence, Elijah kept moving, older now, leaner, sharper. He carried the weight of 10 years on his back, but also something else: control. Because the longer they failed, the more afraid they became of what his freedom meant. They didn't just want to catch him anymore. They needed to. And that desperation would cost them everything. Year 10 didn't begin with a chase. It began with a lie. The KKK told themselves Elijah Moore was dead. Not officially, not publicly, but in the closed rooms where plans were made and names were crossed out, his file stopped moving. New targets appeared, new towns, new fears to manufacture. Elijah had become something worse than a problem. He had become an embarrassment. 10 years of riders, 10 years of threats, 10 years of whispered certainty that this time they had him only to come back empty-handed. Men mocked quietly. Allies questioned competence. Younger recruits wondered why a single black man still haunted their ranks like a ghost. So they did what organizations always do when they fail quietly. They denied the failure ever existed. And that was Elijah's most dangerous moment. Because Elijah knew better. He felt it in the way the roads changed. No more sloppy patrols. No more men riding loud and drunk. No more obvious traps. Instead, clean towns. Smiling sheriffs. Calm deputies who watched too closely and asked nothing at all. The hunt hadn't ended. It had matured. And Elijah was walking into its final form. The town was called Ashford. It was the kind of place that pretended to be modern. Brick storefronts, fresh paint, a new courthouse with a bell that rang every hour. Elijah arrived under a borrowed name and took work repairing wagons behind a livery stable. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. That should have been his signal to leave. But exhaustion makes men greedy for peace. And Elijah stayed 1 week too long. The first sign was the woman at church. She dropped her hymnal when Elijah passed, bent down, whispered without looking at him, "They know." That was all she said. Elijah didn't ask who. He didn't need to. That night, the town locked itself. Shops closed early. Lamps went dark. Dogs were brought inside. At the edge of Ashford, riders gathered, not in robes, not chanting, not loud. Quiet, organized, professional. Elisha watched from the loft above the stable as shadows moved with purpose. He counted at least 20 men, too many to outrun, too spread out to slip past. They weren't searching. They were sealing. This wasn't a mob. It was a net. Elijah waited until midnight, then did something he had never done before. He walked straight into the open, down the main road, lantern in hand. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He knocked on the sheriff's door. The knock echoed louder than any gunshot. The door opened slowly. The sheriff recognized him instantly. So did the men behind him. For a moment, no one moved. And in that moment, Elijah understood the truth. They hadn't expected courage. "Name," the sheriff said. Elijah gave it. A false one. Then he did something that shifted the room. He spoke first. "You want me," Elijah said calmly. "You don't want what happens if you miss." Murmurs, unease, a flicker of doubt. Fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hesitates. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a standoff of belief. Elijah told them everything they didn't want to hear. That 10 years of failure had weakened them. That towns remembered burned barns longer than speeches. That every wrong man punished made the next order harder to obey. He didn't threaten. He explained. And that terrified them more. Because men who explain don't expect to lose. The sheriff hesitated too long. That was enough. Elijah stepped back into the night, lantern still lit, walking, not running, down a side street no one had blocked. No one stopped him. By dawn, Ashford woke to an empty road and unanswered questions. And the KKK woke to the realization that after 10 years, They still didn't own him. Worse, they never would, because Elijah Moore was no longer just a man escaping them. He was proof they could be escaped, and proof is contagious. After Ashford, Elijah Moore stopped running away. He began running through. Towns blurred together, rail stops, river crossings, half-built roads where no maps agreed. I shall learn to move where authority was weakest, places in transition, new sheriffs, temporary judges, men wearing badges that hadn't yet earned fear. He changed his pattern. No more long stays, no more quiet labor. Now he passed through like weather. The KKK responded the only way they knew how. They spread stories, not warnings, myths. They told towns Elijah was violent, that he poisoned wells, that he turned communities against themselves. Flyers appeared with his description distorted beyond recognition, taller, scarred, eyes unnatural. They wanted people afraid before he arrived. What they didn't realize was that fear cuts both ways, because every exaggeration made people curious, and curiosity erodes hate faster than sermons. In one town, a farmer hid Elijah beneath a grain cart, not because he trusted him, but because the KKK demanded the farmer's help too quickly. In another, a school teacher delayed a patrol by asking pointless questions, watching the riders grow impatient and careless. These weren't allies. They were cracks. And cracks spread. By year 11, Elijah's name stopped being whispered with certainty. It was debated. Did he really exist? Didn't they say he died? Why hasn't anyone proven it? The KKK's greatest weapon, control of the narrative, was failing. And they knew it. So they changed tactics again. They stopped chasing Elijah. They chased what he left behind. Anyone suspected of helping him was punished. Jobs lost. Loans denied. Families threatened quietly, bureaucratically. No fires. No ropes. Just pressure. Clean. Legal. Invisible. This wasn't hatred. It was containment. Elijah felt it immediately. People who once spoke now avoided his eyes. Doors that once opened stayed shut. Fear had learned a new shape. And Elijah understood something that night beside a frozen creek. If he kept moving, others would keep paying. If he vanished completely, the pressure would lift. Escape was no longer enough. The story had to end. On his terms. He chose the river. Not to cross. To wait. The Mississippi was loud enough to erase sound, wide enough to swallow tracks. Elijah built a temporary life along its bends, fishing, listening, watching traffic move like blood through the country. He let rumors circulate. That he was sick. That he was wounded. That he'd made a mistake. He wanted them close. They came in spring. Not as riders, as officials. Men with warrants signed vaguely enough to mean anything. They searched boats, questioned dock workers, posted notices offering rewards without names attached. This was the last phase. Quiet extermination. One night, Elijah left evidence on purpose. A torn boot. A dropped knife, footprints leading to the river's edge. And then nothing. No body. No blood. No confirmation. The men waited 3 days. then 5, then a week. The river gave them silence. The reward quietly disappeared. The warrants expired. The officials reassigned. Because you cannot prosecute absence, and you cannot terrorize a ghost forever. Years later, people along the river would tell stories not of a fugitive, but of a man who outlasted an entire organization simply by refusing to be captured. No monument was built. No headline printed the truth. But the KKK never claimed him. And that omission mattered more than any victory they could declare. Because power depends on endings. And Elijah Moore denied them one. For a long time after the river, the world behaved as if Elijah Moore had never existed. That was the KKK's preferred ending. Not defeat. Erasure. They let the rumors rot. Let the whispers contradict each other until truth blurred into folklore. A man can be hunted. A myth cannot. But erasure only works if everyone agrees to forget. And history rarely cooperates. In the years that followed, something strange happened across the counties Elijah had passed through. Men started saying no more often. Not loudly. Not bravely. Just consistently. A clerk misplaced a form. A sheriff delayed a warrant. A banker approved a loan he probably shouldn't have. Small decisions. Individually meaningless. Together disruptive. The KKK noticed their grip weakening, but they couldn't point to a cause. There was no rally to crush, no leader to hang. Just friction everywhere they went. Like the land itself resisted them. Elijah was still alive, but not where they looked. He stayed near borders of states, of jurisdictions, of responsibility, places where paperwork died and memory thinned. He took work that didn't leave records, slept where no one asked questions because asking would have required effort. He learned to age himself, gray in the beard, a limp he didn't need, a habit of silence that made people underestimate him. Time became camouflage. Once, in a southern town years later, he heard his own name spoken by a stranger, not as a warning, as a question. Do you think that man ever really existed? Elijah didn't answer. He just listened as 3 different versions of himself were debated, none accurate, all incomplete. That's when he understood. They hadn't failed to catch him. They had lost control of his meaning. The KKK tried one final strategy. They began claiming victory. They told new recruits the fugitive had been killed, driven mad, or forced into submission. They needed closure to keep belief intact. But lies age poorly. And every time someone asked for proof, there was only silence. No body, no date, no record. Just a gap. Elijah lived long enough to see the organization fracture. Not collapse. Fracture. Infighting. Paranoia. Accusations that someone somewhere was still helping him. A ghost had turned them against each other. And ghosts are expensive to fear. Near the end of his life, Elijah stopped moving. Not because he was tired, because the chase was finally over. No more notices, no more questions, no more riders, real or imagined. He chose a place where nobody cared who he had been, only who he was now. An old man who fixed nets, who spoke rarely, who never stayed out after dark. When he died, there was no marker, no name carved, just a grave that didn't matter to anyone looking for history. And that was the point, because the KKK never got what they wanted most. Not his body, not his confession, not his defeat. They never got the ending. And without endings, power decays. Slowly, quietly, until one day it's gone and no one remembers when it lost its grip. Years later, long after Elijah Moore was buried beneath a name no one would remember, the KKK still told the story. They spoke of him as if he had vanished suddenly, as if fear had swallowed him whole, as if the hunt had ended because they decided it was over. That lie mattered to them, because the truth was harder to survive. The truth was that Elijah didn't escape by running forever. He escaped by outlasting belief. Every organization that feeds on fear needs one thing more than violent certainty. The certainty that resistance ends badly, that running is pointless, that power always collects its debt. Elijah broke that certainty. Not once, not loudly, but for 10 years straight. Every failed raid, every false lead, every rider who returned empty-handed. Those failures didn't just exhaust the men chasing him. They exhausted the idea that the KKK was inevitable. You could see it in the way towns changed. Meetings grew smaller. Hoods stayed folded longer. Younger men hesitated before joining something that couldn't finish what it started. Fear doesn't disappear all at once. It leaks. Somewhere in the 1910s, a former Klansman wrote in a private letter never published, never quoted publicly, that there were hunts that cursed the hunters. Elijah was one of them. Men who chased him lost jobs, lost marriages, lost sleep. They drank more, trusted less, accused each other of betrayal. The KKK had built itself on unity through terror. Elijah turned terror inward. No statue was raised. No song was written. But in certain families, stories changed. Parents stopped saying, "They will come for you," and started saying, "Be careful, but don't believe they're untouchable." That shift mattered more than any victory speech ever could. Elijah never told his story. He understood something history often forgets. Survival is not a performance. If he had spoken, they could twist his words. If he had written, they could burn the pages. If he had boasted, they could hunt his pride. So he chose silence. And silence denied them the last word. By the time records became clearer, names archived, and historians started asking questions, the trail was already cold. Too cold. All that remained were gaps, and gaps terrify systems built on control, because gaps suggest freedom. The KKK hunted Elijah Moore for 10 years. They had numbers, weapons, money, political cover. He had none of that. Just patience, memory, and the refusal to give them the ending they needed. And that is why even now his name still unsettles them. Not because he fought them, but because he escaped them completely.